Sarah recommended us to a talk on Joko as part of a series of first generation of American women Zen teachers, and I hope that you've had a chance to listen to it. First thing that I remembered reflecting afterwards on the talk is a little talk that Barry gave on Joko's legacy a few years ago, in which he said that actually not the least significant aspect of Joko's legacy was that, in his words, hers was the face of a woman. It can't be underestimated the contribution and the complexity of actually being one of the first generation of women Zen teachers. The phrase Zen master, when we think of a master, somebody authoritative, in command, and indisputably male. We could think about a Zen mistress, and that wouldn't be the same thing at all. And that's not a joke. It's the way that our language operates as part of the assumptions we make about gender within our society. And I suppose where I'm heading with this is the importance of that connection between Joko bringing home the idea of Zen as part of our society rather than as something separate. One of the things she said was that the function of our practice is to challenge our fantasies about ourselves, about the world. That includes about our teachers and what we think practice is for. And when I think of the real contribution of Joko to Zen, I'm kind of following the line that my teacher, Joko's student, Barry Majid, has laid out, and I've tried to articulate clearly. But as it was pointed out last time I was talking about Joko, while I think that contribution is finally in the terms that I was talking about, that clearly was not Joko's plan, because she was in real life. She wasn't working from a theory. She wasn't working about an idea of what Zen should be or shouldn't be. She was in a practical situation coming out of the Zen Center of Los Angeles. So she was working out of the immediate situation without necessarily a definite plan, in the context where a lot of what you would think of as the relevant examples were clearly as much examples of failure, of crisis, of problem, as they were of the continuity between teachers and students within a lineage. She had to work out what to do. And one of the questions which she asked and carried on asking was, does our practice serve our life, or does it help us hide from it? And then we're back to those fantasies again, aren't we? Our convenient places for not looking at ourselves, for not looking at the world, for not looking at each other honestly. And I come back to our lives, because Joko was always very clear that it's not all about me. I may have what I think of as my great realization, my little or even enormous enlightenment, but it's how it shows up in my life, and my life is something I share with everybody else. Does practice serve our lives or help aside from it? And of course, one of the things she's well known for is in a lineage which was fairly obsessed with koans. Koan curriculum as the basis of marking of progress, of insight, of just abandoning working with koans. And again, Barry was talking another Dharma talk a few years ago and saying, and I had this dream, and I was back with Joko, and I was saying, hey Joko, wouldn't it be great to actually, for students who have got to a certain level and have got maybe stability in their practice and need a bit of a challenge to start working with koans again? And he says, and in the dream, Joko just looked at me, and she didn't even have to say anything. It was, no. So, teachers and students. There was quite a lot in the talk about Joko trying to undermine and question that traditional notions of hierarchy between teacher and student. Things about sitting anywhere in the zendo, about not dressing up unless there was a particularly good reason for dressing up. And this is one manifestation of challenging fantasies, trying not to become the object of fantasy of her students, which is, of course, with any master-pupil relation, what tends to happen. The more so in the case of exotic and exciting foreign male teachers, and of course the reason why Joko founded San Diego as a separate from Zen Center of Los Angeles was to address what I heard of, put it this way, underlying character flaws within her teachers. Alcoholism, sexual abuse, anger, all these issues. And obviously, as a senior student at Zen Center of Los Angeles, Joko had the standard range of options. She could either do what most people did and just ignore what was going on with her teachers. She could actually valorize that, get into a particularly deluded state where that in itself showed how wonderful they were, how truly enlightened they are, way beyond good and evil, or, mundane, everyday ideas of morality or value. Many students over the years have done that. Or she could just walk away, have nothing further to do with Zen. Or she could take her own realization, her own practice, her own response, and do something with it. And obviously the San Diego Center was the practical outcome of that, where she and Elizabeth Hamilton, so in that sense, the two senior people in that Sangha were both women. And of course there's a very strong tradition of women within the San Diego Sangha. And try something new. And obviously, it must have been a horrifying, devastating realization that one teaches who one respects, who one loves. It's difficult to work with somebody for years and not love them in a very meaningful sense. Realize they're profoundly wrong. They've gone astray. They've fallen in the ditches. And that doesn't negate everything they've done. It doesn't completely invalidate their teaching. But what do? Things cannot go on like this. And that's obviously one very practical impetus towards the psychological slant of Joko's teaching. How do we actually avoid this? And the realization that a number of people in different places were beginning to come to, that spirituality and life were not separate realms, not separate areas of experience, that what was seen as high levels of spiritual attainment actually just didn't begin to address the realities of one's own psychic life. And again, I think I've said before, you can understand this. Often elderly Japanese male teachers in a completely foreign society, thousands of miles from home, suddenly treated with adoration by students and a lot of skeptical by non-Zen American people. It must have been really weird. No wonder they went so profoundly wrong. So that things had to be worked through. Working through our psychological issues were part and parcel of practice and could not be so. And of course this has it's not exactly a side effect, it's not actually a byproduct. It places front and centre how you and I are with each other, how we actually conduct ourselves in the world, how we respond to each other, how we respond to the world. And what can seem to be a very, although it shouldn't be, a very navel-gazing, introspective practice, made it at once an interpersonal practice, an intersubjective practice. And of course this emphasis on problems, on noticing, on the awareness of where we ourselves are not at one with the world, with our life, in one sense stands this traditional idea of attainment to something beyond, attainment to something at once deeply internal but deeply out there, something I can strive for. And so I just forget all the bad stuff. I forget all the problems because they're not the good stuff. Suddenly, it's my resistance to the world, my resistance to my life as it is, as the practice principles say, which is the core of my practice, just simply being aware, being with. And it is quite revolutionary. And it comes, we presume, directly out of this response of, well, that way of working just didn't work. It didn't work here. We have to try something new. We have to try something which directly addresses what was going wrong. And by doing so, and by making, again in very Zen terms, a hugely appropriate response to the difficulties of the real life situation, Joko finds a very solid, what seems at the time a quite revolutionary, even disturbing relationship to practice, a disturbing idea of what practice actually is. Not separate. And in doing so, means that spiritual life, enlightenment, attainment aren't something out there or up there, they're here, now, or they're nowhere. So practice, instead of just abandoning suffering in some marvellous way, becomes about facing suffering, because that's what our real lives are. That's our experience of resistance to life as it is, our actual life in this moment. What goes wrong becomes the basis of our practice, and because if there's nothing wrong, we'll find something. If there's nothing wrong, we'll make something. There is always material with which to practice. And this situational approach is very much the way in which eventually Joko comes to organise her lineage, her successors, the Ordinary Mind Zen School. The talk described it as something like a loose affiliation, which it kind of is. And again, Barry tells the tales about, well, in the beginning, we used to try and have meetings to, find what was the common ground of ordinary mind, and basically we couldn't. Too many people coming from too many diverse traditions. And again, Joko wasn't most of her heirs, probably not for any of her heirs, their first teacher. They were coming from a tradition, from a practice, very often a strong practice, sometimes a practice which had found its own kind of problems. And they worked through Joko, and she helped them become what they were individually. But never with a sense of, well, you have to reproduce me, you have to reproduce what I've done, you have to think exactly the way that I do. And in one sense, that leads to a lack of a kind of house style or a strong corporate spirit forging along together. And at the other end, it's allowed for great diversity of practice, for teachers to develop in the directions which allow them to fulfill their teaching practice most fully. On balance, I think it's a strength. But it's important from the point of view of, challenging hierarchy. In actual fact, challenging hierarchy is literally challenging the power of the priests. Hieros. Hierarchy is etymologically rule by priests. And I say that just because, Barry's coined the term curative fantasy as the projections, what we think we want coming to Zen, which is, we've been trying our strategy for surviving life and it's not been working as well as we want to, and we're still suffering. So we want to try and perfect it. We come to Zen, that'll do it. That'll fix us. And how will Zen fix us? Well, our teachers will give us something profound and something wonderful. They will give us the insight, the knowledge. Oh yeah. Just read a page or so from Everyday Zen here, because it's one of my favourite little Joko quotes. This is a very radical teaching and not for everyone. People often turn away from such a teaching. They don't want to hear it. What do they want to hear? What do you want to hear? Until we're ready, which usually means until we've suffered and have been willing to learn from the suffering, we're like baby birds in a nest. What do baby birds do? They open their mouths upwards and wait to be fed. And we say, please stuff your wonderful teaching into me. I'll hold my mouth open, but you put it in. What we are saying is, when will Mummy and Daddy come? When will a great teacher, a supreme authority, come and stuff me with that which will end my pain, my suffering? The news is, Mummy and Daddy have already come. Where are Mummy and Daddy? Right here. Our life is always here, but since my life may look to me like discomfort, even dreariness, loneliness, depression, if I actually were to face that, life as it is, who would want that? Almost no one. But when I can begin to experience this very moment, the true teacher, when I can honestly be each moment of my life, what I think, what I feel, this experience will settle into itself and to just this, the joyful samadhi of life, the word of God, and that is Zen practice. And we don't even have to use the word Zen. This Mummy and Daddy that we've been waiting for are already here, right here. We can't avoid the authority, even if we want to. And I think it's fascinating that that talk is called in the book, Authority. And if you think about it, our whole lives are dealing with authority, one kind or another. We start out literally with Mummy and Daddy, who are the authority, but they're not the authority in isolation. They have the authority in relation to the government, all the institutions of which they're a part and we become a part. Our life is just one interaction with authority after another, and she's absolutely right. We want to be fed, we want to be looked after, and sometimes we have the experience of that and often not. And of course Joko does this wonderful standing of its head. Mummy and Daddy are really life as it is, and maybe we should just literally do a talk on trying to explore that idea of standing authority on its head. Oh yeah, and then of course there's the last paragraph here. There's one final little illusion that we all tend to play with in this question of authority, and it's, well then, I'll be my own authority. Thank you. No one's going to tell me what to do. What's the falsity in this? I'll be my own authority. I'll develop my own concept about life, my own ideas of what Zen practice is. We're all full of this nonsense. If I attempt to be my own authority in this narrow sense, I'm just as much a slave as if I let someone else be the authority. But if you're not the authority and I'm not the authority, then what? We've already talked about this, but if it's not understood clearly, we may be floundering in quicksand. How do you see it? So I think Joko's core legacy is just this simple determination that practice is not about avoidance. It's about being present, not in some woofy mystical sense, but in refusing not to face these problems of authority suffering, all that comprises my life as it is. Being unwilling to see practice, being unwilling to see Zen as, in that sense at least, a method of escape. I think we can take these notions of hierarchy and challenge the hierarchy and working with authority wider. I think it's no coincidence that this way of thinking Zen really develops some momentum in late 20th century California, in a country which is at least nominally democratic, in a country where there are enough articulate, well-educated people with money and leisure enough to begin to explore their own suffering outside the context of a monastery. Why is Zen predominantly middle class, predominantly white? It's not an accident. That's not entirely a bad thing. It's just who happens to be most easily to address these issues within themselves, within the world. And this business of democracy, I think, is really important and really central. But get back to that in a moment. And yet, I never got to work with Joko as one of her students. I came through the books and through recordings of Dharma talks, and they were wonderful, and they were deeply liberating, and they really messed me up. How does this work? Well, as Joko says again and again, I said it this way and that was wrong, so I said it that way and that was wrong too. And obviously, where you're working over a period of months, years, decades even with a student, you can begin to iron out some of these inevitable misunderstandings. It's not a question of the teacher gives you the word and you go away and now understand it and that's fine. It's relationship. Even when it's coming through a book, even when it's coming through a CD, it's still relationship. And unless there's a way of clarifying the interaction, the interface of these two streams, you bring your own misunderstandings. Of course, you bring your own curative fantasies. Of course, you bring your own misreadings. Of course. And it's not that they're not there in Joko's teaching, because any teaching is ambivalent, and you can say it one way and you can say the opposite. In fact, we frequently do say it one way and say it the opposite way, and they're both true and they're both not. But of course, as a student, you're always, taking one side rather than the other. So the idea of stages and this progress through attainment, that I think is deeply problematic. Joko wasn't big on foregrounding no gain, on foregrounding the you're already there. She's much more about effort, about progress. Not entirely, and again, if you read it, of course, it's all there. But it's kind of like what you're tending to get is one side rather than the other. It's easy to misread Joko saying, well, actually, because so many teachers have actually said this over the decades, it's about not thinking. You just need to stop thinking. We can misunderstand Dogen's think not thinking as just being not thinking. Okay. I'm really not thinking. But of course it's not that. And equally, Joko's very useful, pragmatic distinction between emotion thought and this kind of technical thought. It's very useful, How am I suffering in this moment? Well, I'm really annoyed about what my wife said. Yeah, but is she there? No. Okay, what's going on in this moment? Oh, okay, I kind of get that. But equally, it can mean that we're thinking, oh, well, I can't think about that. I shouldn't be feeling about that. It would be much better if I didn't feel like that. And again, we're immediately off on that. Oh no, I'm looking for the good stuff. Don't want any of the bad stuff, any of my, actually, life as it is, because that means I haven't really attained yet. I'm not at level 4. I was really feeling like I was getting to a level 4 and, And we have so many ways of selling ourselves, just this pop. And I know of one other teacher who she was working with as a student, but, at some distance rather than immediately, saying, well, this played straight into my fantasies about not feeling. Cut. Just cut out the feelings, cut out the emotions, and you'll be fine. And I wasn't. And so, okay. Working with Barry for years, that began to address some of these things, ironed out some of the kinks. It's why the face-to-face thing is so valuable within Zen. We find eventually where we're going wrong. We work things out together. That's the nature of the practice. Suffering. Don't turn away from our suffering. And Joko really showed us how not to do that. And that in itself is enough to build a practice on. And then we can let our tradition, our heritage, our lineage, everything that's happening in the world around us feed and contribute into that. If we just don't turn away.